I learned early that the secret to surviving wasn't fighting back. It was disappearing. Keep your chin down. Lock all 3 deadbolts. Never look twice at the shadows pooling in empty alleys. And above all, never let yourself want anything you couldn't afford to lose in a hurry. For 20 years that rule kept me breathing. It was a cold, quiet life. But it was mine. Until the night the shadows stopped playing by the rules. There was no warning. Just a sudden, sickening drop in temperature. A frost that settles into your bones before it ever touches your skin. Then came the hands, cold as tombstone granite, smelling of turned earth and sour, spilled ink. When they dragged me into the alley, I thought I was dying. When the darkness entered my veins, I knew I was. It burned like liquid ice. The shadow poison moved through me with a frantic, suffocating hunger, clawing away everything I used to be as my body convulsed against the pavement. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My vision narrowed and my heartbeat stumbled once, twice, and then it stopped. For one impossible second there was nothing. No pain, no cold, just darkness. And then I saw 2 eyes in the fog. They were not dark like the creatures holding me. They were gold, brilliant, ancient, and terrifyingly bright, like twin flames burning through the night. A man stepped out from the gloom. He looked almost human. Almost. His gaze dropped to the blood beneath me and something shifted in his face. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darkened as the creatures holding me recoiled in sudden, frantic terror behind him. The man spoke one sentence, quiet, deep, and steady as stone: "Let him go." They didn't. That was their mistake. I never saw exactly what happened next, just a flash of gold and the sharp crack of something hitting brick. Then, strong, solid arms were beneath my body, lifting me off the wet pavement and holding me close. I should have been terrified. But as the warmth from his chest seeped through my soaked clothes, I felt something I hadn't felt in 20 years: safety. The last thing I remember before the dark took me again was pressing my fingers weakly against his coat, wondering why the monster in the dark was the first thing that had ever made me feel safe. I didn't know his name. I didn't know what lived inside him. I didn't know what I was becoming. I only knew one thing: for 20 years, I had survived by making sure nothing could ever get close enough to take me. That night something found me anyway, and somehow, it saved my life. Chapter 1. What the Shadows Took. I should have known better than to take the shortcut home after dark. But after an exhausting 8-hour shift at the accounting firm, all I wanted was to crawl into bed. I hurried down the pavement, pulling the collar of my coat tight, desperate to hide my scent. In a city like this, my traits always marked me as a target. I am an unbonded Omega, and my natural scent, sweet cinnamon and warm vanilla, is a dangerous vulnerability. Usually it stays buried under cheap laundry detergent, but tonight the stress of the day made it flare. At 28 years old, living in a cramped one-bedroom and keeping my head down in a world that likes its Omegas weak, claimed, or contained, I thanked God for the boredom. Predictable meant safe. Until the air turned sharp and metallic. I smelled the ozone half a second before my brain caught up, and pure panic spiked through my chest. My scent answered instantly, flaring sharp, sweet, and terrified into the cool night air. Every hair on my arm stood on end. I knew that smell. God, did I know that smell? I would have recognized it half dead. It was the exact copper-sharp ozone I smelled 20 years ago, the night my whole family was slaughtered. My mom kept me hidden behind the wardrobe, squeezing me into the dark gap while her hands trembled against me. I watched it all happen through the crack in the wood, watched impossible shadows move, watched everything I loved burn down in minutes. When the dust settled, the police didn't understand a single word I kept saying. No one understood what I saw. Some called it shock, some called it trauma, wrapping my truth in medical terms to make themselves feel safe. They filed it away as an unsolved tragedy because no one could explain what had actually happened to my family. Now, as that bitter metallic tang hit the back of my throat all over again, I knew I had never been crazy. It was back. This isn't happening, I told myself. You're 28 years old, Edward. You're 3 blocks from your apartment. This is not. But the shadows between the street lamps had already started to move. They peeled up off the brickwork like burnt skin lifting off a wound. My apartment keys slipped from my numb fingers, hitting the pavement with a metallic click. 3 figures materialized from the empty air, shadow walkers wearing robes the color of old bruises. The dark between us lived, curling up off the ground like liquid midnight, wrapping around my ankles before my legs could move. The cold hit like a physical blow, a bottomless freeze crawling like frost across glass. My family. This is how they died. Oh God, this is how it happened to them. The shadows climbed my knees, my chest, wrapping around my throat with a gentle, suffocating pressure. My scent spilled into the alleyway completely unshielded. Rich vanilla, sharp cinnamon, and cold autumn rain bleeding out into the dark. The entities flared, reacting to the raw omega pheromones with a sickening, ravenous hunger. The world didn't just dim. It drained. My last coherent thought, right before the dark pinched out the edges of my vision, was that at least it would be fast. At least I wouldn't have to be terrified for long. I was wrong about that. Welcome back to BL Heartstrings for Edward and Lucian's story. If you love immersive tales of supernatural bonds and fierce devotion, please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Chapter 2: The Hunger. The training hall went dead silent the second Lucian's hands started to shake. Out. One word. He didn't have the bandwidth for a second. His vision was strobing at the edges, gold bleeding into a red so dark it was nearly black. Every male in the room knew exactly what that meant. Marcus was the first one out the door. The rest followed before it had even finished swinging shut. Smart. Every last one of them had learned the hard way what happened when they didn't move fast enough. Not tonight. Not tonight. He went down on one knee on the mats. The impact jarred up through his femur into his hip. He pressed his palm flat against the floor, trying to hold himself together through sheer physical contact with something solid. His shirt was soaked through, plastered to his back. His heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his molars, in the backs of his eyes, in the very soles of his feet. The hunger didn't knock politely. It never had. It came up through him like floodwater through a cracked dam. First, a trickle low in his gut, a greedy, curling heat. It had nothing to do with food and everything to do with appetite. The kind that didn't care what it consumed as long as it got to consume something. Blood, pain, flesh under his teeth. It didn't discriminate. That was the whole problem. For 4 impossible seconds, Lucian wasn't a person anymore. He was 6'6" of pure want, wearing a man's body like an ill-fitting suit. Beneath the surface, the beast pressed against the inside of his skin, testing the leather, looking for the seam, the weak point, the place it could finally get out. He held it. He always held it. 300 years of practice and discipline had been beaten into him by males who were long dead. It was the only reason the training hall's wall didn't have a hole punched clean through the cinder block. Slowly the thing receded. It went reluctantly, sulking, leaving him gutted and shaking, covered in a cold sweat that smelled like copper. When he finally opened his eyes and looked down, there was a fist-sized crater in the mat where his hand had been, the rubber melted at the edges. Added to the list, he thought. He didn't bother getting up right away. There didn't seem to be much point, until the scent hit him. It didn't come from inside the sanctuary perimeter. It drifted from 3 blocks north, a sudden sharp spike of rich vanilla, warm cinnamon, and cold autumn rain. And it was saturated with sheer, helpless terror. Lucian's breath caught in his chest. 300 years of suppression, and a single stray wind brought a scent that made his dormant blood burn like liquid fire. The hunger didn't just wake, it snapped to attention. It clawed at his lungs, demanding more. He didn't know whose scent it was. He didn't know why an Omega's fear hit him like a physical blade to the chest. He only knew the hunger wanted it. But tangled directly underneath that sweet, terrified pulse was something else. The sharp, disgusting reek of ozone and rotting shadow. Lucian was on his feet before his brain even registered the move. The beast beneath his ribs roared to life, locking onto a single, absolute target. Someone was hunting an Omega on his territory. Chapter 3: Cold Copper and Cinnamon. 2 blocks out, Lucian caught the scent, and every other thought in his head went straight out the window. Blood was normal, expected. The city was lousy with the smell of blood on any given night. But underneath it, woven like a thread of gold through gray cloth, was something else. Something clean, sweet cinnamon, rich vanilla, and cold autumn rain. It hit him low in the gut, making his fangs throb in his gums like a struck tuning fork. Lucian was moving before his brain finished processing why it mattered so much, his boots eating up the pavement in long, silent strides. He hit the mouth of the alley at a dead run and took in the scene within a single heartbeat. 3 shadow walkers in robes the color of bruises were rippling like oil slicks in the dead air. Pinned between them against the brick wall was an Omega, with tendrils of solid darkness sunk wrist-deep into his chest. Dark hair, pale skin, too pale, the kind of pale that came from massive blood loss. His eyes were open and glassy, his lips moving though no words came out. He was still breathing, but not for much longer. Lucian had seen wounds like that exactly once before, and the victim hadn't lasted until sunrise. Leave him. 2 words. Quiet. The kind of quiet that always preceded something getting torn in half. The shadow walkers turned as one, moving in unison like marionettes on the same set of strings. The temperature in the alley dropped violently, fogging Lucian's breath in front of his face. He didn't give them the chance to think. He went through the first entity like it was made of smoke and bad intentions. Hand straight through the sternum and out the back as the shadow walker came apart into a column of oily black vapor with the sound of wet paper tearing. The second got a forearm across the throat, Lucian using enough force to separate vertebrae from the spinal cord until a brutal crunch traveled all the way up to his shoulder. The third took one look at what was left of his brothers, made a strange, wordless sound, and folded, his shadow collapsing in on itself like a door slamming shut from the inside before he was gone. Silence returned, leaving just Lucian, the alley, the stink of ozone, and the Omega. The male was sliding down the brick in slow motion, his breath coming in stutters as the shadow marks spread across his chest like spilled ink soaking into wet paper. Lucian crouched in front of him, and that scent hit again, closer, stronger, clean, bright, and impossibly familiar, like something he had lost a long time ago and forgotten he was missing. He's not going to make it. Not without. He didn't let himself finish that thought. There wasn't time and some decisions made themselves. He slid one arm under the male's knees and another around his back. The Omega came up off the ground weighing next to nothing, his body already spending its last reserves just to keep his heart beating. Up close, his face was striking and Lucian knew he would remember it for a very long time, an intense connection for two people who had known each other for exactly 90 seconds. Lucian vanished from the alley before the echoes of the fight finished bouncing off the brick, never looking back. If he had, he might have noticed something incredible. For the first time in centuries, his hands had stopped shaking completely. Chapter 4: Borrowed Time. I came back to the world the way a diver comes back up from way too deep, slow and disoriented. There was a sharp pressure behind my sternum that took a solid 10 seconds to turn into pain. Warmth. That was the first thing that registered as wrong. The last thing I remembered was cold, a bone-deep, marrow-deep freeze that left no room for warmth ever again. There was an N4 taped into the crook of my elbow, feeding something dark and viscous into my vein that was absolutely not a standard saline bag. The ache in my chest had downgraded from screaming agony to a low, sick throb that I could feel echoing in my back teeth. I was in a bed, a real bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, soft and heavy, way nicer than anything in my cramped apartment. The room had no windows and was bathed in a low, amber glow that seemed to emanate directly from the dark wood walls. There was no sound of street traffic or city life, just an eerie, heavy quiet. And then my senses fully kicked in. My scent, usually tucked so tightly away, was completely out of control. Rich vanilla and cinnamon filled the room, soft and exposed. But wrapping around it, smothering the terror in my pulse, was another scent, heavy and earthy, filled with cedarwood, ozone, and a deep, overwhelming alpha heat that made my skin prickle with an instinctual, shuddering awareness. There was a man sitting in the corner. Man didn't really cover it, honestly. He was built like something out of a fever dream. 6.5 feet of sheer muscle wrapped in dark, heavy fabric, sitting in an armchair that looked far too small for him. There was a stillness to his posture that felt less like calm and more like supreme effort, as if keeping himself planted in that chair required every ounce of his concentration. His eyes were gold, actual gold, not hazel or amber, but bright and metallic like molten coins under fire. I was fairly sure eyes didn't come in that color on anyone human. "You're awake?" His voice was low and rough at the edges, careful in a way that made me feel fragile or like he was worried I might run. That's not what I was expecting. Not yet, anyway. "Where?" My voice came out as a pathetic rasp, feeling like I'd swallowed broken glass and chased it with sandpaper. I cleared my throat, clutching the soft sheet to my chest. "Where am I?" "Somewhere safe. For now." His gaze moved over me, quick, assessing, clinical. Except there was something underneath it that didn't feel clinical at all. It looked a hell of a lot like concern. "Do you remember what attacked you?" My hand drifted up to my chest before I gave it permission to, my fingers finding a thick cloth bandage taped across my sternum. Underneath it, my skin felt wrong, too hot in some places, ice cold in others, as if my nervous system couldn't figure out what temperature my body was supposed to be. "I don't know their names, but I know what I saw," I whispered, meeting his golden stare. "They were shadows. Impossible, living shadows. I watched them kill my parents when I was 8. Shadow walkers," he said softly, a subtle, sharp realization shifting behind those gold eyes. "They're called shadow walkers. And they never leave anyone who sees them behind. They must have realized you escaped 2 decades ago, and they came back to finish the job." I swallowed hard, the chill returning to my blood. "How did they find me after 20 years? "Shadow walkers always leave a signature behind," Lucian explained, his eyes darkening as he looked at the bandage on my chest. When they strike, they plant a shadow mark. It's an indelible footprint that remains dormant inside you. Once you reached full maturity, that signature activated, lighting you up like a beacon in the dark until they were finally able to track you down. The silence that followed stretched out long and heavy. The air in the room felt thick with his dominant presence, but surprisingly, my Omega instincts weren't telling me to hide. They were doing something far more dangerous. They were telling me to relax. "My name's Lucian," he said finally. Something about the way he said it made my pulse jump, careful and deliberate, as if it cost him something just to put it out there. "And I need you to understand something, Edward. The fact that you're sitting here right now talking to me with marks like that on your chest, that's not how this is supposed to go. Not even close." His eyes flicked down to the bandage once more before returning to mine. "How's it supposed to go?" I asked, feeling exposed lying in his bed under his unwavering gaze. Lucian leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. His voice dropped low, and I had to strain to catch it, listening to the raw bracing for impact tone underneath his words. "You should be dead," Lucian said quietly. "Hours ago. And you're not." I have absolutely no idea whether that's the best news either of us is ever going to get, or the worst. Chapter 5. The Sanctuary. I stayed 3 days before anyone explained anything to me. By the end of those 3 days, I'd stopped expecting an explanation at all. The house was massive. House felt criminally insufficient for a building with more square footage than my entire apartment block. It ran on a schedule that made no sense to me. I had spent my whole adult life clocking in at 7 a.m. Here everything was reversed. People went quiet around mid-morning. They didn't reappear until the sun was long gone. Around sunset, the whole place woke up like a switch had been thrown. Lights came on in rooms I hadn't even known existed. Low voices drifted through the halls. The rich smell of coffee filled the air. Weirdly, I even heard the sound of a video game console being argued over by at least 3 different people. I met Marcus on day 2. He was a wiry guy with a shaved head and a laugh that came out of nowhere, able to fill an entire hallway. He took one look at me shuffling toward the kitchen in borrowed sweatpants and said, "Oh, hell no. You're not eating cereal. Sit down. I will make you actual food." He proceeded to make me eggs, and they were better than anything I'd eaten in a decade. "You're the guy Lucian carried in," Marcus said. It wasn't a question as he slid a plate across the island with casual confidence. 3 days, man. He hasn't left that hallway outside your door for more than 20 minutes at a stretch. We had to literally drag him away to feed. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. "He's been, what? Worried." Marcus said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world, but he also looked like it was the strangest thing he'd ever witnessed. Which, for the record, Lucian doesn't do worried. Lucian does, mission accomplished, see you next rotation. He does not sit outside doors. Why would he be worried about me? He doesn't know me. Marcus's expression did something complicated. I saw amusement and underneath it, something far more careful. "Yeah," Marcus said. "That's kind of the thing everyone's wondering, bro." Over the course of that first week, the black shadow marks on my chest slowly faded to a faint ache. I learned the house the way you learn a new language, piece by piece, mistake by mistake. I learned about the enormous male with the scarred knuckles who never spoke at meals. His name was Talon. Despite his silence, he quietly left a stack of paperback novels outside my door on day 5. There was no note and no explanation. It was just there one morning, like a gift left by someone too awkward to claim it. I learned that the kitchen mostly got used for late-night arguments about whose turn it was to do a supply run, because vampires apparently had extremely strong opinions about coffee brands. I learned too which parts of the house were off-limits. No one told me directly. I figured it out because of the way conversations would subtly shift whenever certain doors came up. There was a wing on the east side that stayed dark even after sundown. There was a room downstairs that Marcus referred to only as the vault, using a tone that didn't invite follow-up questions. I didn't push. I'd learned a long time ago that some doors stayed closed for reasons that weren't mine to know. I had enough of my own locked rooms to respect theirs. What I couldn't stop noticing was Lucian. I found myself tracking him almost against my will. It wasn't just his nightly visits, though those were impossible to miss. It was smaller things. I noticed the way conversation in a room would shift whenever Lucian entered it. It wasn't fear exactly, it was a kind of careful deference. Everyone present was constantly, quietly tracking where he was and how he seemed. I noticed the way Lucian ate alone, every time at the far end of the massive dining table, isolating himself even when the rest of the house crowded together at the other end. I noticed the way his hands would sometimes curl into fists when he thought no one was looking, before he would deliberately, visibly uncurl them, as if practicing the simple act of not holding on too tight to things. I recognized that behavior because I'd spent 21 years doing something similar. I had just used deadbolts in silence instead of my own hands. He used to be different, Marcus told me on day 6 while we were both on dish duty as the rest of the house disappeared into the dark. Before the hunger really settled in, Marcus continued. I wasn't around for that, obviously, but the older guys talk. They said he used to laugh. Like a lot. Annoyingly even. Marcus scrubbed at a pan with more force than necessary. Now he just doesn't. Hasn't, and I don't even know how long. Until you showed up anyway. That's not, I started and stopped. I didn't know how to finish that sentence. That's not because of me felt like a lie even as I tried to form the words. Marcus just shrugged, looking like he'd already said more than he meant to, and quickly changed the subject to a basketball game neither of us cared about. Chapter 6. Proximity. By the end of the first week I had figured out 3 things. 1. The marks on my chest weren't healing the way a normal wound would. They had stopped spreading, a minor miracle according to the house's resident healer, a tiny, terrifying woman named Iris who handled my bandages with the gentle ruthlessness of someone defusing a bomb. But the marks hadn't faded either. If anything, they had settled in, going from an angry red-black to something that looked almost decorative under my skin, like ink under glass, shifting faintly whenever the light hit them at certain angles. 2. Lucian fed me. Personally. Every night, without fail, he brought a glass of something dark and warm. I had stopped asking questions about it around day 4. The first time I asked, Lucian's whole body went rigid and he said very carefully, "It's helping. That's all that matters right now," in a tone that made it very clear not to push. 3. And this was the one I hadn't said out loud to anyone, not even to myself. Lucian made me feel something I hadn't felt in 21 years, safe. It wasn't a locked doors and security systems kind of safe. It was safe like standing next to something enormous and dangerous, while being completely bone-deep certain that whatever it was, it would never turn on you. It made no sense. Lucian was the single most dangerous entity I had ever been in a room with, 6.5 feet of pure muscle with a temper that the rest of the house clearly tiptoed around, treating him like a live grenade with the pin half pulled. And yet every night, when Lucian sat on the edge of my bed and held that glass out to me, his hands were steady. Every single time. There was never a tremor. I didn't know what that meant. I just knew that on the nights Lucian didn't come, absences Marcus chalked up to business with an eye roll, I didn't sleep well at all. I hated how much his absence bothered me. On night 9, Lucian sat down on the edge of the bed like always, glass in hand. I was emboldened by exhaustion or maybe just tired of dancing around the truth. You don't have to do this every night, you know? I'm sure you have better things to do than babysit. Lucian's hands stilled around the glass. For a long moment he didn't say anything, giving me just enough time to think that my words were a mistake. Then Lucian spoke, his voice low and rough, not quite looking at me. I tried. 3 nights ago. Sent Marcus instead. A muscle worked in his jaw. Made it about an hour before I was back outside your door anyway. It felt like something had clawed a hole in my chest. He finally looked up with an expression I didn't have a name for, raw, almost like fear, except I couldn't imagine what someone like Lucian had left to be afraid of. I don't have an explanation for that, Edward. I've been alive a long time. And I don't have a single explanation that makes any goddamn sense. The air between us went thick, not uncomfortable but charged like the moment before a storm breaks. I was suddenly, acutely aware of how close Lucian was sitting, feeling the heat coming off him, noticing the gold of his eyes in the low light. Maybe, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, you don't need one. Something shifted in Lucian's face, want plain and unguarded for just a second, before he visibly shoved it back down. His jaw tightened, his shoulders went rigid, pure control actively being exercised. Drink, Lucian said instead, his voice rougher than before as he held the glass out like it was the only thing keeping him in his seat. Please. I drank, telling myself the way my hand shook around the glass had nothing to do with him, blaming it on the way Lucian's fingers had brushed mine when he passed it over. I told myself it was just blood loss. I was, of course, lying to myself. Meanwhile, far across the city in the dark abyss of the Shadow Realm, Balthazar screamed. He held an ancient prophecy passed down through centuries, a forewarning of a Duskwalker that would lead to his ultimate ruin. It was why his Shadow Walkers never left survivors behind. They were bound to kill anyone who witnessed them and extract their signature from the victim's body. But 20 years ago an error had occurred. His walkers had left the signature dormant inside an 8-year-old boy. Now, at 28, that signature was calling out across the dark, echoing Balthazar's worst nightmare. The boy was now drinking the blood of a pure blood, bonding with ancient power, fast becoming the very creature the prophecy had foretold. Balthazar realized the horrifying truth. If he did not hunt Edward down and end him permanently, the prophecy would come pass and the Duskwalker would destroy him. Chapter 7, Daylight. The first time I asked to see the garden, Lucian looked at me like I'd asked to see the moon. "It's walled," Lucian said carefully. 12 feet of solid stone. No windows face it. It was built that way on purpose generations ago, somewhere the household could get fresh air without worrying about who might be watching from outside. He paused, his expression unreadable. "I haven't been out there during daylight hours in a long time. There's no reason to. We sleep through it." "But I don't," I pointed out. "And you said it's walled. Nobody outside can see in. Which means technically you could." Something flickered across Lucian's face that looked like surprise. The idea had genuinely never occurred to him as an option. "I suppose I could," he said slowly as if testing the words for traps. We went out together 2 afternoons later while the rest of the house slept through the daylight hours behind thick blackout curtains. The garden was overgrown, having gone years without proper care, ivy crawling up the stone walls, a dry and cracked stone fountain, and wild roses tangled into something half feral and twice as beautiful for it. Lucian stepped out onto the worn stone path. I kept waiting for something terrible to happen, waited for his skin to burn, his eyes to change, or for him to recoil from the sunlight like he'd made a mistake. But nothing happened. Lucian simply stood in the middle of it with one hand resting against an overgrown rosebush as the late afternoon sunlight touched his face. Up close he looked almost ordinary, almost. He looked like a man visiting a memory. "My mother kept this garden," Lucian said after a long silence. I went very still. In 3 weeks he had said almost nothing about his past, nothing about his life before the hunger. "She used to say sunlight made things grow that the dark never could," Lucian continued. "I thought that was sentimental nonsense when I was young. I took it for granted. You take anything for granted when you assume you'll always have it." "What happened to her?" "She died. A long time ago. Before the hunger. Before any of this." Lucian crouched down and ran his fingers over a cluster of wild roses with a gentleness that made something in my chest go tight. "I haven't stood in sunlight since I was turned. 300 years. Not once." "Does it still bloom?" I asked, looking at the wild, pale rose he was touching. "The kind she grew?" Lucian looked closely at the petals, his thumb brushing against a sharp thorn without flinching. "Apparently it does." I saw it then, the smallest curve at the corner of his mouth, disappearing so quickly I almost thought I'd imagined it, but it was there, a shadow of the man Marcus said used to laugh. "Why come out now?" I asked softly. Lucian looked up at me as the sunlight caught his eyes, turning them the color of warm honey. For a moment he looked younger than I had ever seen him. He wasn't the leader of a warrior house, nor a male who had spent 3 centuries fighting a beast inside himself. He was just a person standing in a garden his mother had once loved. "Because you asked," Lucian said simply. "And I found that I wanted to give you something. Even something this small." We sat by the edge of the dry fountain until the sun started sinking, not talking much, simply existing in the same space with my shoulder close to his arm, feeling the heat radiating off him in the cooling air. His fingers brushed mine where my hand rested on the stone. I looked down and Lucian didn't move his hand away, and neither did I. After a moment, his palm turned slowly beneath mine, giving me every opportunity to pull back. I didn't. His fingers closed around mine, warm, careful, and almost impossibly gentle. We stayed that way until the last strip of sunlight disappeared behind the stone wall without saying a word, because we didn't need to. For the first time since I came to the sanctuary, I wasn't thinking about leaving. I was thinking about staying. Chapter 8, Escalation. The attack came 2 weeks later and it came from the inside. Lucian had been down in the lower corridors checking the reinforced seals when the house's wards didn't just fail, they shattered. It wasn't a slow deterioration, nor a violent breach from the perimeter. It was an instant, suffocating blackout that swallowed every light in the building at once. It was not a power failure. Lucian knew the difference immediately. This was a darkness that pressed against the stone walls with physical weight, carrying a scent that made his fangs drop and his throat burn with instant, lethal intent. Ozone. Cult. Shadow walkers. His first thought wasn't for the house, nor for the blood reserves, nor the 5 vampires under his command. His first thought was Edward. Lucian cleared the central staircase in 2 silent, terrifying leaps, his sight cutting cleanly through the magical gloom. Edward was in the kitchen, paralyzed mid-motion near the counter while holding a mug of tea. "Edward." Lucian appeared in the doorway, his voice tight with a fury he usually kept locked behind centuries of discipline. "Don't move. Do not move. Do you understand me?" Edward turned, his eyes wide in the gloom. "What's happening? They found you." Lucian closed the distance instantly, stepping between Edward and the doorway, angling his body like a wall, a shield. In the absolute dark, his own eyes were no longer their steady gold. They were shot through with crimson, bleeding at the edges as the hunger surged violently against his ribs. "They shouldn't have been able to," Lucian growled. "The wards, He cut himself off, his entire body locking rigid as he felt the spell tethers outside collapse. The horror hit him in a sharp, cold wave. "They're not here for the house," Lucian growled. "They're here for you." The first shadow walker came through the reinforced kitchen window in a spray of glass and absolute dark. Lucian moved before the shards could hit the floor, faster than human eyes could track. There was a sound like a gunshot as he struck, the force of his blow launching the creature across the room hard enough to crack the stone plaster. But there were more. Shadows poured through the broken glass, pooling on the tile and rising into dark, shifting forms. Beside him, Edward gasped, stumbling backward against the counter as his hand flew to his chest. "Lucian," Edward's voice cracked, laced with agony. "Lucian, something's wrong. I can feel them. I can feel." Lucian turned, just for a second, just long enough to see the black ink-like marks beneath Edward's shirt glowing with an ethereal, violent light. They were responding to the creatures, calling to them like a beacon. The realization spread across Lucian's features like ice cracking. The marks weren't just wounds, they were a key. And that second was long enough. A shadow walker detached from the darkness behind the counter, a hand made of solid, suffocating dark closing around Edward's throat. Lucian heard the strangled, desperate sound that escaped Edward's lips before Edward's feet left the floor. Something inside Lucian broke. Not metaphorically. Not emotionally. Something ancient and vicious inside his blood simply snapped its leash. The decades of carefully cultivated restraint, the deliberate breathing, the endless fight to keep the monster tamed, all of it vanished in an instant. For the first time in 300 years, Lucian stopped trying to control the hunger. He let it out. Chapter 9, What He Couldn't Lose. Everything after that happened too fast for me to process in real time. I only got it back later, in pieces, like a film reel someone had cut up and thrown across the floor. The cold hand around my throat. The sensation of being lifted. My feet leaving the floor. Then came Lucian's voice. It wasn't words, not anymore. It was just a sound, a roar that didn't seem like it should be able to come out of a human throat. I understood, in some distant part of my brain, that I was hearing the hunger. It was off the leash for the very first time. What I remembered most clearly was the heat. Lucian's body slammed into the shadow walker holding me, and the two of them went down in a tangle, the sheer force of it raining plaster down from the ceiling as the heavy oak kitchen table split clean in half, like it had been hit by a truck. Then the cold hand around my throat was gone, the thing it was attached to wasn't there anymore. I hit the floor hard enough to knock the wind out of me, coughing violently as air rushed back into my lungs. Through watering eyes I watched Lucian. I didn't have words for what Lucian looked like in that moment. He was not quite a man, but something terrifying and ancient, his edges blurred with unnatural speed. His eyes weren't the gold I knew, nor the crimson of the rising hunger. They had gone fully black, endless and void, swallowing whatever light was left in the room. Every shadow walker that came through that broken window didn't last more than a second or two. Lucian was on them, through them, past them, moving like something that had stopped being interested in restraint a long time ago. It was the most violent thing I had ever seen. It was also, I realized with a chest-tightening shock, entirely for me. When it was over, the last of them had folded into smoke, fleeing back into whatever dark hole they had crawled out of. Lucian turned around. For one terrible second, I genuinely didn't know if the thing looking at me was Lucian at all. Then the black bled back to gold, slow, like watching a sunrise in reverse. Lucian stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving, his knuckles split, blood running down one arm, his own blood. He took one look at me sitting on the floor of the destroyed kitchen, my hand pressed to my throat, which was already bruising purple in the shape of non-human fingers. Something in his face broke. He dropped to his knees in front of me without seeming to have moved, his hands hovering in the air over me, afraid to touch and afraid not to. His hands were shaking. I had seen them shake before in the hallway when the hunger came, but this was different. This wasn't rage, this was fear. Lucian's voice was wrecked, a barely recognizable torn rasp. Edward, I almost lost you. He stopped, swallowing hard. When he spoke again, it came out incredibly quiet, almost impossible to catch over the sound of my own ragged breathing. I don't know what that means yet, Lucian said. I don't know what any of this means. But I'm not losing you. I don't care what it costs. I'm not. My throat was too bruised to speak, the words caught behind swollen tissue and pain, so I did the only thing I could do. I reached out, closed my shaking hand around Lucian's and held on. Meanwhile, in the depths of the void, Balthazar watched the last tether of shadow dissolve into absolute nothingness. Fury, cold and ancient, radiated off him like an abyssal winter as he looked down at the surviving walkers kneeling in silence before him. Useless, Balthazar hissed, his voice echoing through the dark like grinding stone. All of you utterly useless. He stepped forward, the dark curling around his boots like smoke. I see I have no choice. I will go get him myself. The marks on the boy were growing stronger with every passing hour. Driven by pure blood essence, the signature was awakening into something active, something alive. Soon, the boy would be able to sense Balthazar across the realms, just as clearly as Balthazar could sense him. For creatures of shadow, that alone spelled total doom. They were shadow-born, entities never meant to be tracked, hunted, or seen. And yet this boy was rapidly becoming the very beacon that would lead to their absolute extinction. Balthazar's dark eyes narrowed into sharp, lethal slits. He would not wait for the prophecy to fulfill itself. He would tear the sanctuary apart with his own hands and end the boy before the Duskwalker fully opened its eyes. Chapter 10, The Pull Away. 3 days after the attack, Lucian started avoiding me. I noticed immediately. By now, I had memorized the rhythm of his footsteps in the hallway and knew the particular weight of his presence outside a door. A low hum of awareness had settled into my chest like a second pulse. For 3 days that hum went quiet. Lucian fed me through iris instead, refusing to meet my eyes when our paths crossed and finding reasons to be in any room I wasn't. By the 4th night I had enough. I found Lucian on the roof, brooding probably came standard issue with the golden eyes and the muscle, staring out over the city with his arms crossed and his jaw set like granite. You're avoiding me, I said without preamble, 3 days of being handled like an unexploded bomb having burned through my patience. I'm not. Lucian stopped then started again. I am. Yes. Why? Lucian's hands flexed at his sides. When he turned around, his face showed an expression I had never seen before. It looked almost like shame. Because of what happened in that kitchen. His voice was low and hoarse. You saw what I am, Edward. You saw what lives in me. I came that close to losing myself completely to the hunger. And if I go all the way under... He stopped, swallowing hard as the terrifying truth cut through him. For 300 years, the hunger has only ever wanted to consume, Lucian whispered. Blood, bane, flesh, anything that could satisfy it. But in that kitchen, for the first time in my existence, it didn't want to consume. It wanted to protect you. It used my body to slaughter them for you. That terrifies me, Edward. He stepped closer, his golden eyes wide with panic. If I lose control like that again, I won't know the difference between an enemy and the person I'm trying to keep alive. And you think the answer is to push me away? I think the answer is that I can't have this. The words came out raw and torn. I can't have feelings this big for someone, and also be a thing that could kill them by accident. That's not fair to you. You've already survived enough. You don't need to survive me too. I crossed the stone roof before my brain could stop me, stopping close enough that Lucian had to either back away or stay. Lucian stayed, and that told me everything I needed to know. 20 years ago, I said quietly, I watched the shadows take everything from me. I spent the next 2 decades making sure I never let anything get close enough to take anything else. Locked doors. No relationships. No letting anyone in. I swallowed past the remaining ache in my throat. And then you carried me out of an alley. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't scared of the dark. I'm not scared of you, Lucian. I'm scared of you deciding I'm not worth the risk. Edward, you don't get to make that call for both of us. My voice cracked, but I didn't look away. Not after everything. You don't get to decide I'm too fragile to choose this for myself. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then Lucian's hand came up slowly, giving me every chance to step back as he cupped the side of my face, his thumb brushing along my cheekbone with an incredible gentleness. If I hurt you, Lucian said, his voice barely a whisper, I will never forgive myself. Not ever. Then don't, I said. Choose not to. Every single time. That's all anyone gets to promise, Lucian. Not perfection. Just choosing over and over. Lucian's forehead dropped to rest against mine. For the first time since the kitchen attack, I felt that familiar hum settle back into place in my chest. Only this time it was different, steadier, warmer. Lucian pulled back just enough to look at me, his golden eyes searching my face as though he still couldn't quite believe I was standing there willingly. Soon, he said, the word barely a whisper. Not tonight. Tonight, I just need you to still be standing here. I understood what he wasn't saying. He needed time to learn how to live with this, so I nodded. Okay. I stayed beside him, and for once Lucian didn't ask me to leave. We stood there until the sky began to lighten at the edges, shoulder to shoulder. Neither of us pretended that the danger had disappeared. It hadn't. The hunger was still inside him, volatile and unyielding. The shadow walkers were still coming for me. Whatever was happening between us still didn't have a name. But Lucian stayed, and so did I. Chapter 11, The Trap. I woke up from a terrifying dream, shadow walkers in a dark abyss, hovering all around as the marks on my chest reached out to them. I woke up startled, drenched in sweat, looking at the clock to see it was just 11 in the evening. The dream was so vivid that I immediately went to Lucian's room to explain what had happened, only to find an urgent summons had arrived. A breach at the city's northern border that required the head of the house personally. Lucian had argued fiercely against going, his jaw locked tight as he paced the study looking ready to set the message scroll on fire. Go, I told him, stepping into his path so he had to look at me. You can't have your entire life revolve around whether I'm safe every minute you're breathing. Lucian's jaw tightened further. That's exactly what I'm worried it already does. Then trust me, I said softly. The house is warded now. It is triple reinforced after the kitchen. Marcus and Talon and 2 others are staying behind specifically to make sure nothing happens. Lucian stared at me for a long moment, a heavy, bone-deep reluctance lingering in his golden eyes. Finally he nodded. I'll be back before dawn. I know. It was the last conversation we had before they took me. It happened 2 hours after midnight. I felt it before anyone else did, a sudden freezing pressure slamming against my chest as the marks under my shirt flared with vicious pain. I barely had time to shout a warning to Marcus down the corridor before the wards came down all at once, collapsing like a held breath finally released. The house filled with shadow from floor to ceiling. This wasn't 3 shadow walkers. This was a dozen, maybe more. Marcus went down fast, not killed but buried under living shadow, pinned and struggling uselessly against the dark, and the other vampires fared no better. Then the shadows parted and a tall figure stepped through the ruined doorway. It was Balthazar, shrouded in robes so impossibly dark they seemed to swallow whatever ambient light remained in the hall. The Dusk Walker, Balthazar said, the word landing in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. The moment Balthazar stepped forward, the marks beneath my shirt changed. They weren't burning anymore, they were moving, black veins of shadow pulling inward toward the center of my chest, twisting beneath my skin as though something inside me had suddenly woken up. Balthazar stopped, appearing almost surprised for the first time. You really don't remember, he whispered, his voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. My blood went cold. Remember what? The hood tilted. What you are. Cold hands of solid dark seized my arms, lifting me off my feet. This time there was no sound of shattering glass, no heat, and no Lucian crashing through the darkness to tear them apart. Tell your vampire, Balthazar said, leaning close enough that I could see endless, shifting dark beneath the hood, that we're simply taking back what belongs to us. My stomach turned. I don't belong to you. Balthazar tilted his head again as if genuinely amused. You still don't remember. The marks on my chest erupted with white-hot light and I screamed. But beneath the pain, beneath the terror, something deep inside me answered the darkness. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. Then the world disappeared. Chapter 12, Silent Fury. He felt it 40 miles away. The moment the wards around the sanctuary collapsed, a violent, wrong sensation struck his chest like a physical blow, doubling him over mid-stride in the dark outskirts of the northern border. His pulse hammered against his ribs, wild and frantic, drowning out the faint sound of the spell scroll in his hand as it flared and died. Then Marcus's voice cut through the distance, faint and choked as he relayed what had happened. Lucian didn't remember the journey back. He moved faster than sound, a streak of desperate velocity cutting through rain-slicked stone and open air, his chest roaring with a panic he hadn't felt in 3 centuries. When he reached the sanctuary, the heavy oak doors were hanging off their iron hinges. The silence inside was worse than a battle, smelling heavily of ozone, scorched marble and crushed shadow essence. Marcus was propped against a ruined pillar, bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts and shouting through dark blood about a location, a warehouse down near the docks. Lucian didn't stop to heal him, nor did he ask questions. The world narrowed to a single burning needle of focus, the absolute need to reach Edward. He found the warehouse by scent alone, a pole, a clean, bright thread he had followed once before in an alley that felt like a lifetime ago, except now it was tangled with shadow poison and terror. He crashed through the warehouse's brick wall as if it were made of paper. What he found inside would stay with him for the rest of his existence. Edward was suspended a foot off the stone floor by ropes of solid shadow, the marks on his chest blazing white-hot through his shirt. Balthazar, radiating cold like a physical weight, held his hand wrapped around Edward's throat. "You're too late," Balthazar said, his voice echoing as if from the bottom of a well. "He's all ready?" Lucian didn't let him finish. The hunger didn't just break its leash, it exploded out of him. 300 years of restraint detonated outward in a single, unbroken wave of absolute devastation. In seconds, Lucian tore through the surrounding shadow walkers, turning them to ash and smoke as the sheer pressure of his aura crumbled the surrounding walls into dust. Then he turned to Balthazar. Balthazar was no ordinary shadow. As Lucian lunged, Balthazar raised a hand, unleashing a blast of abyssal dark that struck Lucian like a solid engine, sending him skidding across the cracked concrete. Black, corrosive tendrils whipped out, binding Lucian's arms and biting into his flesh with agony that burned hot as fire. But Lucian's eyes were pitch black, devoid of light, void of mercy. Screaming with ancient fury, Lucian tore through the shadow tethers, his sheer pureblood strength snapping Balthazar's magic like rotten twine. Balthazar summoned a blade of solid gloom, parrying Lucian's lethal strikes in a flurry of sparks and shockwaves that shattered every window in the harbor. They moved like twin storms. Balthazar weaving lethal void magic, Lucian driving forward with raw, terrifying, unstoppable power. Balthazar drove his dark blade straight into Lucian's shoulder, but Lucian didn't even flinch. Instead, Lucian gripped the shadow blade with his bare, bleeding hand, pulled himself forward, and slammed Balthazar into the stone floor with bone-shattering force. With his black eyes burning, Lucian plunged his hand into Balthazar's chest, tearing out the core of his shadow essence. As Balthazar's robes began to dissolve into smoke, his hollow eyes widened in a sudden, horrifying moment of clarity. Looking from Lucian's relentless, monstrous form to Edward's glowing body, a chilling truth echoed through the dying shadow's mind. The prophecy, it said the Duskwalker would lead to our doom. It only forgot to mention who would bring that doom to us. With a hollow, deafening gasp, Balthazar disintegrated completely, his essence scattering into nothingness. The dark collapsed inward, leaving the warehouse in dead silence. No shadow walkers. No shifting dark. Just Lucian breathing hard, his eyes black from edge to edge as he stood in the rubble, cradling Edward's limp body against his chest. Edward wasn't breathing. No. Lucian's voice broke entirely. The black fury drained out of him all at once, leaving him hollowed into nothingness. He fell to his knees in the dust, cradling Edward's head against his shoulder and pressing his hand flat over the younger man's chest. "No, no, no, Edward. Edward." He pressed his fingers to Edward's throat. Nothing. No pulse. No warmth. "I wasn't fast enough," Lucian whispered, his body shaking with a violent tremor born not of blood fever, but of total ruin. "I shouldn't have left. I should never have left you." He lost track of time kneeling there in the wreckage. The universe had collapsed into the cold weight of Edward in his arms and the terrifying silence where a heartbeat should have been. A sound tore out of Lucian's throat, not a word nor a roar but the raw expression of absolute loss. And then a flicker. Faint beneath his palm. Lucian froze, barely breathing. Another flicker, stronger this time. Beneath his hand, Edward's chest rose in a slow, shuddering breath where there had been nothing. His heart kicked once, twice, then settled into a rhythm that was completely wrong, too fast, too strong, and nothing like the soft human pulse Lucian had memorized over the past 3 weeks. Edward's eyes opened, though they were no longer the same eyes that had closed. Lucian stopped breathing altogether. Edward's eyes had always been warm brown, ordinary and gentle, but now something silver dark moved beneath the surface, like moonlight trapped beneath deep water. His pupils narrowed into sharp points, waking up like something otherworldly. Edward looked directly at him, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Lucian." The word was familiar, and the voice was his, but underneath it echoed something ancient that had just opened its eyes for the first time in centuries. And for the first time in 300 years, the hunger inside Lucian went completely silent. Chapter 13, Duskwalker. Days later, after the shattered sanctuary had been rebuilt and a quiet, unshakable calm settled over the house, Edward sat on the edge of the heavy oak bed in Lucian's private quarters. Rain washed gently against the tall arched windows, while the room was wrapped in the warm amber glow of firelight. Lucian stood near the hearth, staring down into the flames. Even now, with Balthazar gone and the shadow walkers scattered into memory, the pure blood carried a stillness that bordered on hesitation, as if he were still afraid that stepping too close might shatter the quiet reality they had built. Edward leaned back against the headboard, watching him. "You're doing it again," Edward said quietly. Lucian turned slowly, his golden eyes warm but guarded. "Doing what?" "Standing a mile away in your own head," Edward said with a soft smile. "The threat is gone, Lucian. We made it." Lucian walked over slowly, every movement deliberate, until he stopped right beside the bed. He looked down at Edward, at the subtle shimmer beneath his skin, at his clear, steady eyes that held no fear. "I look at you," Lucian murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he had kept buried for 300 years, "and I still can't quite grasp that you're here. In my mind, I'm still running through the rain 40 miles away, feeling the wards fall, thinking I was going to be too late." He sank down onto the edge of the mattress beside Edward. His large hands rested on his knees, trembling slightly before he forced them still. "I've spent 3 centuries surviving," Lucian whispered, looking into Edward's eyes. "I thought the hunger was my curse, a monster I had to keep locked in a cage so it wouldn't destroy everything around me. But when I thought I lost you in that warehouse, it wasn't the hunger that almost broke me, Edward. It was the realization that I couldn't exist in a world where you didn't." Edward felt a sudden rush of warmth flare in his chest, a flutter of butterflies born not of fear, but of an overwhelming sweet certainty. He reached out, covering Lucian's shaking hand with his own. "I spent my whole life hiding from the dark," Edward said softly, his thumb brushing across Lucian's knuckles. "I built walls around myself so high that no one could reach me because I thought staying safe meant staying completely alone. But you didn't just break down those walls, Lucian. You carried me out of the shadows when I had nothing left, and you gave me a reason to want to live." Lucian lifted his hand, gently cupping the side of Edward's face. His thumb traced along Edward's cheekbone with reverence, as though handling something infinitely precious. "I don't know what the future looks like for us," Lucian said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what being a Duskwalker means for you. I don't know what will awaken next, or what the world will expect from something it has never seen before. But I know this, my life, my blood, my protection, they are yours. Every single day for the rest of my existence." Edward tilted his head into Lucian's touch, closing his eyes for a quiet moment to soak in the heat of his hand. When he opened them, the dark, shimmering silver in his gaze held Lucian completely. "Then stop holding back," Edward said softly. "No more fear. No more keeping your distance to protect me from yourself. Choose me, Lucian. Right now." Lucian leaned in close, his hot breath brushing against the sensitive skin of Edward's neck. The air between them grew thick, charged with an undeniable, intoxicating intimacy. Lucian paused just an inch away, his golden eyes searching Edward's face one final time, asking the silent question he would always ask. Edward simply closed his eyes, tilting his head back to expose the long line of his throat, resting his hand firmly over Lucian's chest right above his heart. With a slow, deliberate gentleness, Lucian pressed his lips to Edward's pulse point before his fangs pierced the skin in a smooth, seamless bite. A quiet gasp escaped Edward, but any brief sting dissolved instantly into a wave of profound, intoxicating warmth. He felt the steady, ancient hum of connection deepen between them, weaving their souls together and sealing their bond once and for all. As Lucian drank, the roaring, violent hunger that had haunted him for 300 years went completely, beautifully silent, replaced at long last by peace, belonging, and a quiet promise that would endure forever. Epilogue, 6 months later. The garden looked different in spring. Edward knelt by the fountain as water trickled over restored stone, a project he had taken on himself over the past months with a stubbornness that had made Marcus laugh so hard he'd nearly fallen into it. Edward watched sunlight scatter gold across the surface of the water. 6 months had passed and he still hadn't gotten used to it, he probably never would. Every morning he woke to daylight streaming through the window felt like a small, ongoing miracle, the kind you didn't take for granted twice. The marks along his arms had settled into something permanent now, neither poison nor decoration, but simply part of him, dark traceries that shimmered faintly in direct light like a night sky he carried under his skin. Iris had spent weeks documenting everything, cataloging what he could do that neither vampire nor human could. He could walk in daylight, he could sense shadow magic at a distance, and, the part that still made Edward's chest tight every time he thought about it, he could occasionally, faintly feel Lucian. It wasn't words, but just a presence, a kind of warmth at the edge of his awareness, steady as a heartbeat, telling him without needing to look exactly where in the house Lucian was. It worked both ways. Lucian had told him quietly, not long after the transition finished, that for the first time in 300 years, the hunger had gone quiet. It wasn't gone, it would never be gone, but it had settled like a storm that had finally found the shore. Lucian still trained every evening, keeping the discipline that had held him together for centuries, but he didn't disappear to the training hall in a panic anymore. He didn't need to. "You're doing the thing again," Lucian said, settling down beside him at the fountain's edge, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Staring at the water like it owes you an explanation." "Just thinking." "About?" Edward considered it. Outside the walls of this garden, the city went on the way it always had, mostly oblivious to the world underneath it, ignoring the wars fought in alleys and warehouses that never made the news. The shadow walkers weren't gone entirely. Marcus still ran patrols, coming back some nights with stories that made Edward's chest go tight with old fear. But the coven that had hunted him, the one that had called him theirs, was ash in memory now. That chapter, at least, was closed. "About how I used to think surviving meant making sure nothing could ever get close enough to hurt me again," Edward said finally. "Doors locked. Nothing to lose because I'd already lost everything that mattered." He turned his hand over, watching the marks catch the light. "And now I've got more to lose than I've ever had in my life. Should terrify me. But it doesn't." Lucian's hand found his, easy and unhurried, no longer something either of them had to think twice about. "Because you're not surviving anymore," Lucian said quietly. "You're living. There's a difference." Lucian shifted closer, his hand gently sliding up to cup Edward's cheek. His golden eyes, softened with an overwhelming warmth, searched Edward's face before he tilted his head and leaned in. When their lips met, it was slow, tender, and lingering, a kiss filled with 300 years of devotion and a newfound promise of peace. Edward leaned into the touch, closing his eyes as a rush of butterflies flared in his chest, melting into the solid certainty and comforting heat of his alpha. Lucian's thumb brushed softly against his jawline, deepening the kiss for one lingering, breathless moment before pulling back just enough to rest their foreheads together. Edward looked into those brilliant golden eyes, watching the sunlight catch the trickling water of the fountain. He thought that for the first time in 21 years, longer maybe than he'd ever consciously realized, he wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop, nor bracing for the dark to come back and take this too. The dark had already tried. And it had lost. Some things in the end weren't about being saved. They were about choosing, every single day, to stay. The end. If you enjoyed Edward and Lucian's story, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with fellow story lovers, and subscribe to BL Heartstrings for more original BL audiobooks and stories. Your support keeps these worlds alive. See you in the next story.